Hi, I'm Alicia Michelle, best-selling author, ICF certified coach, and neurocoach. I love helping Christian women discover practical ways to manage emotions with science and scripture so they can live with more calm, more clarity, more confidence. I'm so glad you're here. Find a cozy spot and let's get started. Hi there, and welcome to another episode of the Christian Mindset Coach with me, Alicia Michelle. When we are working through an emotion or any sort of difficult thing in our life, it's really important to remember the truth that we're focusing on in today's episode, and that is we have way more power and control over what goes on in our head than we think. It's very easy to let an emotion, a thought, go down a path that leads us to a place where we think life is hopeless, things are terrible. And I love that today's conversation with a neurosurgeon, Dr. Lee Warren, explains and encourages us that when we choose to focus on things differently in the brain, it affects our neurophysiology and changes brain patterns. We've talked about that on the podcast here before, but that it was just a great reminder that you and I, we have the opportunity to take back control over what goes on between our ears, how we respond to the things that are around us, that there will be tragedy, there will be hard moments, there will be fights in family, there will be difficulties in marriage, there will be loss, there will be things that come up unexpectedly, but God is inviting us to say, I can live above that. As Lee referenced in our conversation, I can live out John 10:10, which says, I came, meaning Jesus says, I came so that you may have life and life abundantly, that we can choose to live in that life. Now, as you'll discover, there is processing that needs to happen if it's been some big thing that we've walked through. It's important to recognize from the very beginning when we look at these emotions that we have a lot more power and that God is calling us to pick up that power. So this conversation with Dr. Lee Warren was really a testimony to that. And that's why I wanted to share it with you today and have you learn a little bit more about what that means for us to pick up that power and to take control over our thoughts. But what it also means from a scientific standpoint, but also from someone like him who has walked through some very challenging, very horrific events in the past. So here is that conversation with Dr. Lee Warren. Lee, welcome to today's show. Thank you so much for coming on today and sharing a little bit more about this new book that you're doing. And again, a very unique perspective on neuroscience from a neurosurgeon. Thanks for being here.
Thanks, Alicia. I'm so grateful to be with you today.
Yeah, thanks. So tell us a little about you. How did a neurosurgeon that ends up working on a very different side of the brain now start working on how to help women and men manage their thoughts?
What came out of my life, the thing I think helps me the most in these kind of conversations is that I'm not dispensing expert advice from just this sort of high-level brain science standpoint, but I write about these things and talk about them because I've lived them. I went to the Iraq War and came home with PTSD, and went through a divorce, lost a child, all these things that have happened in our lives. My wife and I, Lisa and I now have been together for 20 years, and the process of figuring out all the different ways that life had broken me and how really it took my faith and what I understood about science together to help me find my way back and help my family find their way back. So I started writing about that stuff and podcasting 13 years ago now after Mitch died from the perspective of, hey, this stuff really hurts and it really messes you up, and here's some things we're doing that seem to be helping. And it just sort of started building momentum, and now I've written 4 books about it. And so that's where it came from.
Yeah, but this book specifically seems more targeted on how to work through it yourself, like how a person can work through that with more techniques and things like that. For someone kind of hearing this concept for the first time, this self-brain surgery, how would you describe that in simple terms?
I think the most important thing, if you're not familiar with brain science and neuroplasticity and all these big words that we use, the number one thing you need to know is that society tells us very strongly these days that we are the product of how our brains work, and that our brains work the way they do because of the genes that we inherited and the parents that raised us and the stuff we've gone through. Your circumstances, your traumas, your tragedies, your personality, your Enneagram score, all that stuff creates the brain the way it is. and that you're stuck with that and you have to figure out how to manage it. And so that's the message we get from society. What 21st century neuroscience is really teaching us is consistent with what Scripture's always said, which is that your thoughts actually structurally change what your brain is and how it works, and therefore you have agency, which is this ability to do something about the situation you're in. You're not stuck with the brain that you have. The genes that you have don't tell the story of how your life turns out. And so you have hope, therefore, because there's something you can do about it. And that's why this new book is more about prescriptions that you can write yourself to operate your brain in a different way if you don't like how your life's playing out. Or if your thoughts and feelings aren't serving you, if your automatic reactions aren't serving you well, if you've got habits or numbing behaviors or things that you've gone through that are sticking you in some place in your life, you don't have to stay there, because your brain will change structurally in response to you changing what you think about all the time. And it's not controversial, and it's not a metaphor. It's actually how your brain is designed by your creator to work if you're willing to do the hard work of learning how to do it. And the reason you do it yourself, the reason I call it self-brain surgery, is that no therapist or pastor or spouse or anybody else can do this work for us, because the work happens inside our mental space, where the actual change of how your brain becomes something different than it has been starts with your thinking changing. And nobody can change your thinking for you except you. Now, when I say that, the Christian out there will say, wait a minute, God helps us and all that. And that's true. But God doesn't change your brain for you. He gives you the processes by which to do it. He gives you the tools. The Bible says he works in us to will and to act in accordance with his good plans. So he wants you to do this. He's provided a mechanism by which you can do it, and he's there to help you do it, but you have to do it. You mentally imagine yourself, God handing you the scalpel to operate your brain in this way. That's why you become a self-brain surgeon. It's not self-reliance. It is self-help, but God's there to help you do it.
I think that you hit the nail on the head with this whole responsibility for our own thoughts. I think it's, of course, there are factors that have shaped us, like you mentioned, PTSD from the war, a death of a child, these things that happen that shape us, of course. But God says, so this is where you're at. How can you be responsible now to allow me to come in and use the ways that I've made your brain to get the healing?
That's right.
Yeah. And love that you have that conviction. Do you feel like that's probably the first hurdle? That's what I would guess, is that's the first hurdle that people need to come against is, hey, this may have happened to me, but now it's my responsibility to realign it with what God says about me.
That's right. It's another one of these societal messages that we're getting, right? That trauma is stored in your body and adverse childhood experiences shape you in certain ways, even if you're unaware of them, and that you just are how you are because of the stuff that's happened to you. But what we know now, and lots of people have written about this, I'm not the first person to write about it, Gabor Mate and others have written, trauma is not actually the thing that happened to us. It's the set of responses that we made in response to what happened to us. For example, if my future ability to be happy or healthy or purposeful or have a good life was dependent on my circumstances, then I'd be hosed because my son died. And that makes you sad as a parent. I'll always be sad about that. But the fact is, it's not the inherent reality that my son died that determines what my future has to look like. It's the decisions I make. It's the things I ponder. It's the choices that I make in response to that. And if those choices aren't helping me, the good news is I can choose different ones. And so all of us know somebody, for example, who, say 20 years ago, their husband cheated on them, or their kid was killed in a car accident, or their mom got cancer and died at 35 or something. All of us know somebody like that. And if you meet them today and you say, hey, Sally, what's going on? The first thing that comes to mind is, ever since that happened, I just haven't been able to, I just got back from a meeting about this. I still can't move on from this thing. It becomes the defining event of their life. All of us know somebody like that. But we also know somebody who went through the exact same sort of thing. Maybe even two people in the same marriage who went through the same loss of a child, the same child. And they have vastly different outcomes because the other person, somehow that event changed something in them, broke something apart, and they became a different person in response to it. And maybe their life in some way is better than it was before, not because the thing happened, but because they found out what their purpose was, or they turned that loss into a legacy that they could build something around that they're proud of now. And so that means that it's not the event that we go through. It's not the circumstance. It's not the other person's behavior. It's not the way our dad treated us when we were 6. It's not that thing that defines who we have to be. It's our response to it.
Yeah.
And so all of a sudden now you have agency, again, this opportunity to change something, a belief that you can change it. Social scientists define hope as agency and opportunity. So can you do something about it, and are you able to do that thing about it? And so if you have those two things, then you can have hope that things can be different for you in the future. And it turns out neurologically we're wired to change our brains in response to what we think about, and that the neurochemical environment in our brain, all of us are familiar with neurotransmitters, serotonin, everybody's taking serotonin reuptake inhibitors for depression and all that stuff for their anxiety. But the neurochemical environment in your brain reliably improves when you think about better things than you were thinking about before. That's why Philippians 4 in the Bible says, hey, if you want to be less anxious, be grateful instead. Or if you think about things that are good and noble and true and trustworthy and lovely and all that, then you'll be guarded with peace. Your heart will be filled with peace. And we can put you in a scanner in 2026, in a functional MRI scanner, and I can show you, this actually happened to us. We got to watch this at research as part of what I wrote this book about, that you can put somebody in a scanner, and you can say, Mrs. Johnson, think about the worst day of your life, right? Think about the hardest thing you've ever been through. And their fear center will light up. So they'll think of that thing, and their brain will react to that by lighting up the parts of your brain that are lighting up when you're afraid of something real. So your brain doesn't know the difference between something that's really happening and something you're just imagining or remembering or worrying about. And so the fear center will light up, and then the physiology of the body will change in response to that brain event. So your heart rate will go up, and your blood pressure will go up, and respiratory rate will go up, and all that stuff. So you can see this chain of connection between mental activity to brain activity to body activity, right? And then you can say, okay, Mrs. Johnson, quit thinking about that, and now think about your best day ever, the happiest thing you've ever felt in your whole life, the day your kid was born, the day your husband proposed, whatever it was. And you'll see that fear center will turn off, and the frontal lobes will come online, the cingulate gyrus will come online, and then the physiology will get better. The heart rate will come down, blood pressure will come down, all that stuff will improve. And you can, again, see this chain of events between mind to brain to body. And that means that Philippians 4 was right 2,000 years ago before we had those scanners. That if you don't want to be anxious, be grateful. Switch what you're thinking about from this thing to that thing. Your brain will change, and your body will change, and you'll be filled with peace. So we know now, this is interesting, you can't, neurologically, you can't actually be anxious and grateful at the same time. Because your hippocampus is a one-way switch. Now, people say all the time when I say this, somebody emails me or writes in or stops me after a speech and says, hey, yes, I can. I do it all the time. I'm grateful, but I'm also super anxious. The truth is you can switch rapidly between two different states. You can't actually be in a state of gratitude and a state of anxiety at the same time, which means if you can then force yourself to derail that anxious thought, and you can ponder and focus on and stay in a moment, for example, of something that you're grateful for, you're happy about, or a different train of thought, then you will over time deflate the metabolic energy that part of your brain was getting that's creating the anxiety, and you will inflate, activate other parts of your brain that will overtake that, and you'll have a different neurochemical environment than you had before, and you can prove to yourself that you actually aren't stuck with anxiety. That's not to say that sometimes you don't need help or you don't need a therapist or something, but you can actually prove it to yourself. You can take your body out of a particular state and into another one by deciding to think about something else. So the Bible's correct about that. It was neuroscience, that they work together.
Even with people all around us, it's so easy to feel unseen. Have you noticed that we live in a world where we're connected to a ton of people on social media and even in person, yet many of us feel lonelier than ever? Genuine connection often feels hard to find. If you've ever felt lonely, even while surrounded by people you love, I want you to hear this. Loneliness in midlife is incredibly common, and it doesn't necessarily mean something is wrong with us. Midlife brings changing friendships, shifting family dynamics, and seasons where we begin longing for deeper connection than we've experienced before. And that's why it's something I'm excited to explore as our July topic inside the Emotional Confidence Club. We're going to have conversations about loneliness and emotional disconnection this month in the club, while also practicing science and scripture-based emotional management tools that help us respond differently to these feelings of loneliness. Because emotional health isn't just something we learn about, it's something we practice. And I love the club's format of a lab. It's a place where we can learn tools and get encouragement and ideas, and then we apply them to our real life situations. If you've been longing for deeper connection with yourself, others, or God, and you're ready to work through these emotions around feeling lonely in midlife, you're invited to join us in the club. Visit aliciamichelle.com/club to learn all the details and to join us. Yeah, that's fascinating. I've seen that in my own life doing this work. When we change our thoughts, it really is changing the chemical environment in our brain, and we begin to develop new patterns that reinforce what we were thinking. I mean, we're deciding, are we going to reinforce the bad, or are we going to reinforce where God wants us to be? My question for you is for the woman who says, okay, so you're telling me that if I'm going through this and I just need to stop and be grateful, then that's going to help me. You and I can sit here and go, yeah, we can show you from a biological standpoint how that's going to help you. But how would you encourage a woman who's like, but in order for me to get to that place, there's a big chasm in between there of what I have to work through or process in order to really honestly with myself feel grateful, feel released, feel joyful, feel the things that Philippians is talking about there. How do you encourage or walk through that sort of
That's
situation?
a great question. And I get a lot of people will push back and say, some people are more cognitive, some people are more emotional based. And some of the therapists will say, you got to work through the dysregulation. And there's some people that are so dysregulated that they can't cognitively engage in this process, or that maybe they don't have anything to be grateful about. So it's not such a binary, it's either gratitude or anxiety. What I think you should focus on is the fact that you have the power to interrupt an adverse physiological state if you choose to manage it. And what I mean by that is, if you can't think of something to be grateful, for example, if that doesn't work for you to be so cognitive about it, you can do one of these grounding technique, or you can engage with one of the vagal techniques like breathing. So breathing is a good example. Your parasympathetic nervous system will override your sympathetic nervous system if you direct it through focused breathing. And so how do you do that? You take a deep breath in through your nose for 4 or 5 seconds, hold it for 4 or 5 seconds, and then let it out. And what is that going to do? It's going to activate your vagus nerve, which then decreases your heart rate. Physiologically, it always will decrease your heart rate. That's one of the ways that we get people out of supraventricular tachycardia is we tell them to do breathing exercises or carotid massage to activate the vagus nerve. So you can get your vagus nerve to fire on your behalf, and you can calm down or deflate that anxious state that you're having by taking physiological control of it, right? But I just want to point out that, and this is what I always say to my colleagues who are more on the body side of this equation, is I want to point out that in order to activate that, in order to do that, you first have to decide, you have to mentally engage the process of taking command of this physiological trick that God gave you of interrupting an anxious state. You're still doing the same thing I'm describing. You're just doing it on a kind of a body first way. And the reason I want to point that out to you is not to say, look, I'm right about this. It's to say you have incredible power. You never have to be overwhelmed, because as soon as you say, you know what, I'm going to take a deep breath, you can. And when you do that, you're going to engage some physiology on your behalf that will deflate that hippocampal amygdala activation thing and get that fight or flight thing moving back towards a regulated state. And yes, it's true that when you're in a dysregulated state, it means that your limbic stuff is more active than your frontal lobe stuff is more active, less active and all that. But the idea that people's frontal lobes are offline isn't actually what the truth is. The truth is it's a switching mechanism, and they're going to be on or off, and you can turn them on as soon as you engage your parasympathetics and get your tone up. And it's a mental act that does that. And so just feel some power there, because one of the problems that anxiety disorders, for example, and grief can generate in us is this sense of powerlessness. And I had that when I had PTSD after the war. This is really interesting because at that time I'm 35, 36 years old, practicing neurosurgeon, board certified brain surgeon, expert at neuroscience and all this stuff. I got all the paper on my wall and all the certifications and all that stuff. And I'm sitting at a stoplight with my wife, Lisa, next to me driving in Alabama, and a helicopter goes by at about eye level. The next thing I know, she says, she's shaking me. And she said, Lee, what's going on? And I said, what do you mean? She said, you just sat through 3 red lights. Like, you just completely checked out.
Wow.
And I was like, what? What do you mean? Like, I had no idea that happened. And then the next day, I was giving a talk at the Rotary Club, and it was in a restaurant. And somebody shut one of those walk-in freezer doors, the big doors, and they make kind of a vacuum sound, like a kind of sound.
Yeah.
And it sounded like the sound that you hear when a mortar round is launched, like that. Wow. And I had a full-on panic attack for the first time in my entire life. I'm 35, 36 years old. I've been home from the war for a few years. I'm probably 37 or 8 by then. And I started saying, okay, 2 days in a row I've had neurologic events that were out of my control, that I wasn't expecting. And I know what they are because I understand this, but why is this happening to me? And then I remembered that 4 days prior to that, we watched a show on HBO that was called Generation Kill. I remember the name of it. And it was about the Iraq War. And I'd come home from the war and I got a divorce. Like all this stuff happened to me while I was at war, really. And then moved and got out of the Air Force and started a civilian practice and reconnected with my kids and then met Lisa and married Lisa. And all this stuff happened. And all these years went by that I was working and I never dealt with anything that happened in the war. Literally brought a trunk home with my uniforms and a bunch of shrapnel that I'd taken out of people's brains and all these stuff. And I put it in the trunk in my garage and never opened it and never talked about it and never dealt with it. Got out of the Air Force and went to work. And then 4 years later, we watched that show. And during that show, a guy gets blown up in a bomb and a helicopter lands and the medics come. And one of the medics says to the other one, we're going to take this guy to the hospital at Balad. And I remember turning to Lisa and said, that's where I was. I was there. That's what I did. They brought that guy to me. I would have been the doctor taking that guy off the helicopter.
Wow.
And that night was the first nightmare I had. And 2 days later, I checked out when I saw a helicopter go by. And the day after that, I had a panic attack when I heard. So I'm just saying all that to say that you can be as cognitive as you want about it. And when you go through certain kinds of trauma, if they're not adequately dealt with, they can come back into your life and that can seem out of your control.
Yeah.
But once I started digging into why that stuff was happening and what the process is of getting better about it, the real getting better starts as a mental event, is a decision that I am going to overcome this with whatever set of helping things I need and people that I need, whatever resources, personnel I need to do that. It's something I'm going to do and nobody can do it for me.
That's a really great point because it's very easy, I think, to take the first part of our conversation and go, that's really nice, because all he has to do is just say, think differently and choose to focus on this, and then it's going to solve my problem. But you just described a situation, not everyone deals with PTSD in the way that you've described, but there is some sort of trauma maybe that keeps them stuck in anxiety, overthinking, people pleasing, the types of things that the ladies listening to the show are familiar with. And they're like, it's just not that simple for me. Or if I do it, it feels very insincere. It feels very superficial in the moment. And so I think what you're alluding to is that, okay, you have the agency. You have to first have the cognitive agency to say, I can take control of this. And also to say, and you know what? Maybe it's more than just in this moment. I need to learn how to be more calm and work through this. There might be some deeper things here that I have to work through, that I have to deal with. And God is not bringing this up for me to hide from it, but he's bringing it up for me to say, this is a signal of something deeper that I'm gently calling you to get curious about and address because I want you to be whole.
That's right.
And so there is that inner process too that needs to happen that I think is separate from what you're describing here. Is that accurate?
That's absolutely right. When I do my podcast episodes, I always start by congratulating people for showing up to do what I call the hard and holy work. This is hard work, okay?
Yes.
It's hard work to acknowledge the things that have hurt us and harmed us and to acknowledge that we don't want to live in them. Because there's some comfort. There's some social things that happen. In my work, I deal with a lot of people with chronic pain. And one of the hardest things to deal with when people have had pain or some chronic illness for a long time is the social structure that has been built up in their family around them being the person who's sick or the child that's been chronically ill or the relationships that have been developed in response to this issue in this person's life. And once I say, you know what, I can take that tumor out and you won't have that pain anymore, it doesn't change any of that social stuff. Even if I fix the underlying problem, because there's been so much work that's been done to build up these systems and relationships, right? That stuff doesn't go away as soon as you say, oh, I can just change the way I think and fix this, right? So it's hard work and it's holy work because Jesus said, John 10:10, Jesus said, came here, right? So the thief is going to steal and kill and destroy, but I came here that you might have life and have it abundantly. And so he's not saying, hey, someday I want you to be happier. Someday when I come back and fix all this stuff, it's going to be okay. Right now, it's going to really suck, right? That's not what he said. He said, I want you to be able to be in the middle of this steal, kill, and destroy stuff and still have an abundant life. So how do we do both? How do we have been the person who loses a child or goes to war or gets divorced or something happens to him and be a person who can be productive and have a sense of purpose in your life and be happy, or any of those things. How do we do that? And it's by being willing to get in the mud and do the work to go to name it and know it and understand it, but not be willing to live in it anymore. And then say, whatever process I need to master, to get after, to learn how to do, to operate this thing the way God intended for me, to get to that place where I can have that abundance, that's what I'm willing to do. And sometimes I need professional help to do that. Sometimes I need to change some relationships in my life. Sometimes it might cost you something to get this right.
Yeah.
Because there are some people that don't want you to get better because their sort of value in the relationship is dependent on you being the broken one. Right?
I think it comes down to the issue of identity. I'm reminded of that story in the Bible of the man who was crippled, who was by the well that supposedly had healing powers, and he was going to go down, and they were supposed to run down and get in the water and be healed. And Jesus walks over to him and he's, why have you not gone down there? And Jesus just says, pick up your mat and walk. Just stop making excuses for it. But, and I don't think you and I, we have to be careful here. And for those listening, we're not saying that it's not painful or difficult to change these patterns. It is. If this is who you've always been, that person who deals with chronic pain every day, and this is the world you've built and who you've become, for better or worse, it's not as simple as just saying, oh, just pick up your mat and be different. Like, we get that. But there is compassion for that. But there does come a point where I think some of us, God is challenging us to say, I know your pain. Yes, that was awful that you went through that. And I'm telling you, I'm giving you an option to do something different with it. Right. Don't want you to stay stuck in it anymore. I don't want you to keep wallowing in this. So to do that, we have to take those first steps. We have to be willing to look at it and to say, I might have a different identity now because of this, and to do the risky behavior. So I know that for me as a coach, that's the work that I have to first encourage people to step into, because if they're not in that place, then we can't help them. Almost too happy in the mud. To be able to make some changes.
That's right. There's several things that need to be absorbed and believed. So at first, if God says something is possible for you, then it's possible for you, no matter how long you've believed otherwise, right? And if he says something is true, then it is true for everybody as a matter of principle. And so that means if he says in 2 Timothy 1:7, for example, I didn't give you a spirit of fear, but of power and of love and of a sound mind. Right. I gave you a sound mind. So you might have believed that your mind is fragile, your brain is broken, you're all messed up. I gave you a sound mind. 1 Corinthians 2:16 says you have the mind of Christ. Right? Yes. And then in Ephesians, he says that you have the same power in you that I used for Jesus to rise from the dead. You have that same power in you. So we feel powerless and broken because of these events that have happened. And God says, hey, you got the mind of Christ. The great physician is in your spirit and will help you engage in these processes. And then you say, it's too much for me. I'm too broken. And he says, I work in you to do the things that I want you to do in a way that pleases me. Like, all I need you to do is say yes, to say, I'll do it. I'm going to give you the tools. I gave you the brain. I gave you the neuroplasticity. I'll give you the insight. I'll give you the desire to do it. You just have to be willing to say yes. And that's like if I'm going to operate on you, like you come to my office and you got a bad back or a brain tumor or something, God forbid. And I say, okay, I know the problem. Here's the diagnosis. And I've got the prescription that you need. I've got the surgery. I've got the whole team. The operating room's ready. All I need you to do is wake up that morning and not eat the night before and drive to the hospital and sign the consent form. That's all I need you to do, Alicia. You just do that. And you say, it's too hard. It's too much. I can't get out of bed. I'm not going to sign that consent form. It's too scary. You'd say, that's crazy. I could eliminate your problem if you just are willing to do enough work to get to the place where the doctor can do the rest, right? That's what God is saying to us. I've given you the mind of Christ. I've given you the power that raised Jesus from the dead. And understand that it's true on so many different levels. It's not just a pretty metaphor or some nice thing to think about. When he says that Jesus raised from the dead with this power, like, what does that mean? Like, his body was dead and in the ground for 3 days, right? Those cells were dead. Brain was offline. The blood was coagulated. The heart was stilled. He had rigor mortis. Like, that body was dead. 3 days dead. It wasn't paralyzed. It wasn't temporarily drugged or something. He was dead. And when he went back into that tomb, when the eternal, immaterial mind of Christ entered that tomb and said, it's time to wake up, that brain came back online, right? Those neurons fired again. That spinal cord reanimated. The heart began to pump. The blood became uncongealed. The tendons became supple again, and the muscles started firing. And he walked out of that tomb. But he did that with the power that God says you also have. Is your anxiety bigger than that? No. Is your trauma bigger than that? It better not be. Like, otherwise, you're telling Jesus that the power that raised him from the dead isn't enough to overcome your anxiety.
And we forget that because we get so lost in the pain of it and the what ifs. And honestly, that's it. It's scary to think about. We're very familiar with what the pain is.
That's right.
We're familiar with this life of how to respond to this. Even though it's dysfunctional, it's familiar to us. So it does come down to that. In the book, you talk about these 10 commandments of self-brain surgery. And I really liked those. It reminds me of that first one. You said, the first commandment, I must relentlessly refuse to participate in my own demise. This is a great example of it. What does that look like for you in these everyday thinking patterns?
So the whole premise of the self-brain surgery idea is, as we said earlier, you've got to operate your nervous system the way God designed it so that you can be the agent of change in your own life, right? That's this premise. So you're not just patient anymore, now you're doctor too. And on the first day of medical school, they make you take an oath. And the oath is, I won't commit malpractice against my patient. I won't harm my patient intentionally. I'll always try to do what's in the best interest of my patient. So now if you're going to play both roles, like I'm the doctor, but I'm also the patient here, that means you look out for things that make things worse for yourself, right? We all have numbing behaviors that we've adopted.
Yeah.
We don't want to deal with the stressful day that we've had, so we open a bottle of wine and just numb our brains, or we scroll Instagram for 3 hours, or we don't want to engage with our spouse because we're too tired, so we play video games all night, or we shop on Amazon, or we do something to numb ourselves from the issue at hand, and the next day we have trouble because of that, because we still have the original problem and now we spent money or we're hungover or whatever. And so we've harmed ourselves. We've committed malpractice against ourselves and weren't willing to do that hard and holy work that we talked about. So for me, it looks to me like if I'm having a day where I just don't want to feel it and I don't want to think about it, I might scroll on Instagram, I might watch 3 or 4 episodes of something on Amazon and fall asleep and not talk to Lisa or deal with whatever it is I'm dealing with. I might not make that phone call I need to make because I really don't want to deal with it. I don't want to talk to that person. I'm peopled out for the day or whatever. And then tomorrow, now I'm paying a tax on yesterday because I didn't dig in and do the thing. It's another one of the commandments. And I still have the original problem, and I feel bad because I didn't spend time with my spouse after I was gone to work all day. And I've got all these other issues just because I wasn't willing to address the one in the first place. That's malpractice. So I'm committing malpractice against myself, and that's not honoring God. God says, hey, love the Lord your God with all your heart, love your neighbor as yourself, which also means we're supposed to love ourselves, right? Love yourself enough to not harm your patient, even if you're both the patient and the doctor.
And that goes with the 6th commandment that says, I must love tomorrow more than I hate today. Share more about that.
Yeah, so like I said a minute ago, we have these, in surgery we have a phrase, don't treat a bad feeling with a bad operation. So in other words, don't do the wrong thing because you felt something that was uncomfortable right now. And lots of us do that, right? Somebody texts us and we get mad about it and we fire off this angry text. We blow somebody up. We offload our own internal mental state by blowing up on somebody else. We drink, we numb ourselves in some way. And numbing behaviors are really dangerous too, by the way, because you can't selectively numb part of your life. If you emotionally numb yourself from one thing, you become numb to everything. And then you don't feel anything good in your life anymore pretty soon. The one thing that you're trying to cover up has covered up everything. And so then you're narrowing your emotional experience of life. And Jesus said he came here to give you abundance. So that whole thing about the tomorrow tax, about loving tomorrow more, about not treating a bad feeling with a bad operation, there are multiple different ways to say, care enough about your own future that you're willing to be uncomfortable right now in order to make tomorrow a little more possible, that it might feel better. Because better, it turns out, so getting better is better than staying broken. Amen. And it's better than being bitter. Getting better is better than all that stuff. And you can't get better tomorrow by not being willing to deal with today, or being willing to do the hard work to deal with yesterday, or being so fascinated by the things that your trauma is bringing you in your life that you want to hold on to those instead of getting better. So getting better is better than all that stuff.
I think that's a great place to wrap things up here, is as someone who has been to the pit of some of those dark, horrific places of trauma and now living on the other side, what is that testimony you would give to someone about better is better than bitter?
I would say one of the worst things that happens to you when you lose a child is the things that other Christians say to you at the funeral and the days after. These things, people come along and they're well-meaning, but they say things like, God's going to work this out for good, Romans 8:28. Terrible thing to say to a bereaved parent right away. But what I can tell you is that the long arc of time proves out all of God's promises. And so if you can navigate today enough to not kill yourself, and I say that not lightly because suicide is a real thing.
Absolutely.
That happens because of hopelessness and despair in response to overthinking about the events that we went through or identifying with them. So if you can love yourself enough to press through it and not die and not become numb to everything through alcohol or some other adverse choice that you make, if you can love yourself enough to do the hard and holy work to become on that path to better, to get on that path to better, then eventually you will find that everything God said about the process of suffering and the ways he can redeem it turns out to be true. And for my example, 13 years later, after we buried our son, I am a fundamentally different, and I think my wife and everybody that knows me, who knew me before and after, would say I'm a better person, not more noble or more brilliant or any of that, but better human being because of the work that was done in the aftermath of losing my son, because I figured out what my life was about in the aftermath of that, because I was doing some things and holding on to some things that were not helpful, even though I thought they were, that weren't important, even though I thought they were. And now I understand what really is important. And when you lose a child, you really get crystal clear about what's really important, right? And so I can say that God has worked that situation out in the way that verse is meant to be read in context. What it says is not that God will make everything good. And it's misquoted in some ways. What it says is that God will work everything for the good of those who love him. And what I can tell you is it's not good to lose a child. But if you can let God refine you through that process, Isaiah 48:10 says, I have been refined in the furnace of suffering. And there's a lot of people that are defined by their suffering. But if you can be refined by it, then what that means is God will take stuff out of your life. Sometimes it hurts for him to do that, that should never have been there or its season has passed. And he will clarify why you're here in the first place. And then he'll show you what a life of abundance can look like, even though you lost that thing that you thought you had to have abundance. And so if you lose a child, immediately in the short range, you start thinking, my life's never going to feel better than this. Like, how could I ever be okay again? Like, how can anything in the future feel happy or hopeful again? And what I can tell you is that God has a version of your life that you can't taste in the acute phase of grief or pain. But if you choose to stay in that acute phase and let it become chronic, if you choose not to do the work to move through that, you'll never be able to taste that life that he designed for you. That when he says taste and see that the Lord is good, he means it. The truth is there's a richness to our experience that can't be had in the absence of suffering. There's a verse, Romans 5:3-5, I think if I'm correct, that says that suffering produces endurance, and endurance produces character, and character produces hope. Right. And we know now neurologically the way your anterior cingulate gyrus works is the part of your brain involved in willpower and resilience and grit and all that kind of stuff. And it turns out that's the part of the brain that stops working properly in people that get stuck in complex grief, that they just literally can't move themselves forward emotionally. And there's really good research now around willpower that shows that if you can make yourself do something that you don't feel like doing, even a little thing, that your cingulate gyrus learns that you're the kind of person who can do something hard, and then it wires in a lower resistance to the next hard thing you need to do. And these people become more resilient across the board to endurance. And so what we learn is that Romans 5 is true. Like, suffering produces endurance. Like, the willpower comes from having gone through hard things. And then endurance produces character. So what that means is that you start seeing yourself as the kind of person who can do things when you don't feel like doing them. So you suffer, that makes you have more endurance. Then you start to develop this character, this internal confidence. That was a really hard thing I went through. And since I've been around long enough to know that most people go through more than one hard thing, that I'm the kind of person who can get through a hard thing. And then that makes you hopeful that you're not going to be hosed the next time something hard happens. So what I can tell you, 13 years on the backside of having lost a son. All of that stuff is true. It's true spiritually, it's true neurologically, it's true experientially for me, and it'll be true for you too. It's worth it to, since you can't avoid the suffering, it's worth it to do the work to get to the hope part.
Yes, and I've seen in the times when I've gone through intense suffering that willpower, that need to push through, I've found that it's interesting to hear your brain perspective on like how it's working neurologically. But I found if I can push myself to do a hard thing, that's not necessarily the big hard thing I'm walking through. Maybe it's like, I'm going to push myself to run 2 miles today where I normally don't run at all, or I'm going to increase my workout. It shows me on these little things, I can do this.
That's right.
You have the ability to do this. And that's so interesting that neurologically, it's telling that part of our brain, hey, she's the kind of person that can push through hard things. So she can have that also over here too.
That's
so
right.
That's amazing. Well, this is stuff we could talk about for hours. There's just so much here. And again, those of you listening know that my whole ministry is built on this idea that how our body is wired. It was made by the Lord, and it aligned perfectly with how Scripture says it's supposed to be. I love that you're doing that work here. If ladies want to hear more about the work that you're doing, where can they find out more information about you and your book that you just finished? Yeah.
My website is drleewarren.com. It's just drleewarren.com. There's no periods or spaces. I've got a podcast that's listened to in 150 countries every week, newsletter that comes out every Sunday, all kinds of ways to get a hold of us. All the books are in there, and I love to connect with people.
Thank you again so much for being here with us today. Appreciate it.
Thank you. God bless you, Alicia.
Thank you. Wasn't that such an encouraging conversation? I loved hearing all of the scripture that he referenced, and I loved hearing the science behind it. As you guys know, I blend all those things together, and I love that there are other colleagues who do that work, especially someone who obviously knows a lot more about the brain than I do. As a neurosurgeon, he's very familiar with all the parts, and he still is in awe of the gift that God has given us of being able to say, yes, this is real, but no, I don't have to sit in it. And no, I don't have to let this thought become something more than it needs to be. So I hope was an encouragement to you for where you're at today, because all of us are walking through challenging things. But I wanted you to hear too that I brought up in that conversation that there is this power that we have to say, I don't have to deal with this. I need to choose a different path. God tells me this isn't true. There is that power, and that's important. But there is also that deeper work that may need to be done, that it's not honest for us to just say, I'm just going to choose to be grateful. Because in Christian circles, that's very common for us to just say, okay, yeah, so you might be dealing with something hard, but you can choose to be grateful. Or like he referenced Romans 8:28, God's going to work this out for your good. And please hear, that is not the right response. And that's certainly not what I hope that was communicated in this message today, that there is the work that needs to be done in that inner part, that sometimes it's not as simple as just saying, I need to be grateful. I need to just look at things differently. And my encouragement to you would be, after hearing a message like this, is, yeah, there are things probably that you and I in a moment need to have that self-control, that willpower to practice, like he said, with that part of the brain, to be able to practice the willpower, to say, you know what, I can get up and make that call, even though I'm tired right now, even though I don't want to. I can choose to be grateful, even though this is a hard situation. But there are also moments where we say, this was a really big thing that happened in my life or is happening in my life. And I can't honestly just say before the Lord, all right, I'm just going to choose to be grateful and let all of that be ignored, that there are things that need to be worked through. And that is what therapy is for. Therapy is if you feel like there is a trauma in your past or something that happened in the past that you need to work through, that you need to have a trained professional help you sort through the emotions and the feelings that are there, the patterns of how you got there. I highly recommend someone like BetterHelp Counseling. You can go to my link for that. I can give you 10% off your first month of working with these online counselors. They can connect you with a Christian counselor. I've had many clients who have worked with them and found great success. So getfaithful.com/vibrant, VIBRANT. So getfaithful.com/vibrant to get my 10% off discount for my clients and for anyone listening who is looking for a certified and trained Christian therapist. There is also another side of it that you might consider, and that is if you feel like, yes, okay, I know this happened in my past. I know there was a divorce. I know that my dad died when I was 12. I know that affects me, and I've done some of that work. I'm not really needing to go back and rehash some of that. However, I feel like it's more than just me choosing to be grateful in the moment to get through this. I need someone to help me in the moment work through a plan to say, when I'm struck with these emotions, how can I respond differently? What works for me to calm my body and turn on my parasympathetic nervous system like he was talking about? What are those things for me? What are the steps I need to take? I need someone to help me to find that path and help me stay accountable to that change. That's the work that I do as a coach. Moving forward, helping you say, here's where I'm at, so what's next? That's the work that I love to do in coaching. So I offer different coaching programs, different opportunities to focus on a specific topic. I like to do coaching where it's not just, how are you feeling today? And what's going on in your life? And let's talk about that. And what do you want to do about that? And then let's see you next week. That's not helpful. So I have different coaching programs. For example, one of them is the people pleasing mindset makeover. If you struggle with people pleasing, it is 8 concentrated sessions where we work through the questions. Each different session is focused on a topic that I have noticed what this process is like after working with hundreds of women who've gone through this. First, we need to talk about this. Then we talk about this. And within those is where we do the work of how is this showing up for you? It's a little tiny bit of me saying, this is what is happening in your brain, or this is why it makes sense, but it's going back. And how have you seen that for you? If you feel like, I know that there are some patterns that I need to change, and it's more than just me choosing cognitively in the moment, reach out to me. You can go to aliciamichelle.com/coaching, and you'll find what the coaching programs are that are available right now. We do have some that are active at all times, and then we have some that there's a waiting list for. So that's a great place to go to get started. And of course, Dr. Lee's book is a great book that talks more about what he calls the art of self-brain surgery, and that's doing this work to change our thoughts. So you can find that book anywhere books are sold as well. All right, friend, have a great week. I'll see you back here next week for our episode. Bye-bye. Hey, thanks for joining me today. For full show notes and helpful next step resources, visit aliciamichelle.com/podcast. And if you enjoyed this episode, I'd be honored if you'd leave a 5-star rating and review. Thanks for being here. I'll see you back next week.